In Psalm 12:7, God promised to preserve his words. Based upon this promise, I hope you'd agree that somewhere in the world, at least one perfect ancient Greek manuscript must exist for each of the New Testament books. What if I told you that the exact wording of every book of the Greek New Testament has now been identified using careful analysis of all of the Greek manuscripts? This is strong evidence that God has indeed preserved every single word of the Greek New Testament. Unfortunately, most seminaries and churches now teach that we cannot know for sure the exact wording of each verse of the original Greek New Testament. Many of them teach that the New Testament is indeed God's authoritative word to mankind, yet they've accepted the notion that we cannot know for sure the words, the exact wording of each verse of the Greek New Testament. They seem satisfied with the idea that the wording is very close to the original writings, while admitting that the exact wording of many verses cannot be known for sure. They believe this because the manuscripts that they rely on the most have so many disagreements with each other. This short video demonstrates that God has indeed preserved every single word of the Greek New Testament, and that exact wording is evident to anyone who cares to look into this matter. We will consider just one book of the Greek New Testament, II Thessalonians. The principles, though, that are seen in this analysis apply to every book of the Greek New Testament. To understand this properly, you must first realize that in the first century, each book of the Greek New Testament was preserved as a single book rather than part of an entire Greek New Testament. Most of the ancient Greek manuscripts that exist today exist as a single New Testament book or part of a collection of a very few of the New Testament books. There are relatively few entire ancient Greek New Testaments. On your screen is a rough representation of the known ancient Greek manuscripts of II Thessalonians. The small black, green, and red circles each represent a complete ancient Greek manuscript of II Thessalonians. All of the manuscripts were discovered in various places, but mainly in countries not too far from the Mediterranean Sea. Take note that at least 14 manuscripts represented by the black circles, found in a variety of places, agree with each other perfectly, word for word, with the same spelling. 24 green circles represent manuscripts that agree with the perfect black ones perfectly, except for just one slight deviation. In addition, there are several other manuscripts represented by green circles that are extremely close to the 14 manuscripts that agree perfectly with each other. Psalm 12:7 says that God would preserve his words. So the question really comes down to whether you view this subject by faith or whether you believe that God only preserved most of his words, but not every single word. If you believe that God is able to preserve every single word of the Greek New Testament and that he exercised his power to do so, well, you must reject the false narrative that suggests he failed to do that. Now notice the red circles on this screen. They represent the very few manuscripts that disagree with the perfect ones almost 20 times. Yet, the textual critics rely most on two of these manuscripts represented by the red dots. And these manuscripts disagree with each other nearly a dozen times. Now let me appeal to you personally. Do you believe that God is able to preserve his words perfectly? Or do you think that over the years, he allowed a few errors to seep in. Let me suggest that you consider the perfect agreement between ancient Greek manuscripts as evidence that God has indeed preserved his word perfectly, just as he promised. If you really believe that God preserved his words, you should reject the wayward thinking of textual critics who claim we cannot know with certainty every single verse of the Greek New Testament. Keep in mind that they believe this simply because the ancient Greek manuscripts that they rely on the most disagree with each other over 3,000 times in the Gospels alone. The manuscripts of II Thessalonians that they rely on disagree with each other a dozen times. Now, it is true that for 8 of the New Testament books, 2 manuscripts that agree perfectly with each other have not yet been identified. However, for these 8, the exact wording has been identified using the collaborated testimony of other manuscripts that agree almost perfectly. The careful comparison of every manuscript has not yet been completed. It's ongoing. This ongoing analysis only further confirms the identity of the exact wording. If a person ignores this evidence of God's careful preservation and chooses rather to rely on ancient Greek manuscripts that are obviously inferior and riddled with errors, that person is approaching this subject pragmatically rather than by faith in God's promise that he would preserve his words. By the way, the ESV, NASB, and the NIV Bible rely most heavily on the poor manuscripts that are represented by the red circles in my illustrations. For more information, click on the link in the comments of this video, and you can view my video that's called "The Bible is God's Express Word to Mankind." You can also email me personally at stonescryout@aol.com. Thanks for watching.